Good morning. I'm Paul Jenkins, University Librarian at Franklin Pierce University and Principal Investigator of the IDEAL Initiative. Lance Eaton is a writer, educator, and social media consultant who currently works as the instructional designer at Brandeis University in the Rabb School for Continuing Studies. He's here today with us as part of the IDEAL Initiative, which is sponsored by the Davis Foundation. Lance will be discussing the concept of open pedagogy. He'll speak for about 45 minutes and then address your questions. And by the way, he has a large presence on YouTube if you want to see a lot of his other work. So, Lance, take over.
Thank you very much. Hopefully this stage will hold me. So thank you everyone for coming out on this slightly snowy morning and all the hiccups along the way. As Paul said, I'm here to talk about open pedagogy. And the subtitle I give this is Doing by Discipline, and I think it's a really good way of framing what I'm going to be talking about today. And in terms of the outline, the agenda for today, we're going to kind of talk about, if you want to do the next slide back there, I'm going to start first by talking about my course, and then we're going to move into talking about kind of how that has helped shape me think about the blending of OER and open pedagogy, and then we're going to look at a couple of other examples of open pedagogy beyond mine. So moving on to the next slide, I want to talk about my course and kind of where my course came from. So I've done this in many courses. I'm going to talk about my popular culture course initially. And so I started teaching pop culture online, or just teaching pop culture in 2010. And I really enjoyed it. It was a really interesting opportunity. And then I got the chance to teach it online in 2012. And so there was a really interesting transition that took place there and had me thinking a lot about what you could do online. So by that point I've been an instructional designer for a year or so, but really thinking about pop culture as an opportunity, because if you didn't know, there's a lot of pop culture on the internet, right? So after just kind of getting the course up and running for a few years, I moved into kind of thinking about the textbook and really wanting to kind of toss it out. In part, I was already getting exposed to the OER movement, the Open Educational Resources movement, and thinking about, do I really want students buying textbooks? I was teaching this at a community college, so students who are already challenged often economically to be able to cover course materials. Of course, that's true everywhere, but often community college students, I think, feel it even stronger. So I was looking to, switch out that. I was thinking about, well, this is pop culture, and there's a lot of pop culture, both, the object itself and articles, commentary, literature, research, all of those things out there on pop culture. There was the start of a lot of really great materials on YouTube that do these really great takedowns, or I shouldn't say takedowns, but critical discussions of a lot of the things that we were looking at. So I moved into switching out the textbooks in 2014, and I've been a nerd blogging since 2010 or 2011, and that isn't really even when the blog craze really took off, but I was doing a lot and thinking about that as a public forum, as a means of engagement and interaction with with the world at large, and thinking about, again, here's pop culture. So much of what we do in the course was talking with other people, or really kind of engaging in it. And so thinking about giving my students a platform to do that besides the classroom, a space where they can kind of demonstrate to people outside of the classroom, like, this is what we're talking about. Like, because pop culture as a course, particularly at a community college and particularly online, comes with a whole lot of assumptions, right? And it's something I have to work to within the course, but outside of the course, students get it as well. They get the challenges of, like, you're taking pop culture online, so, what are you doing? Just filling out Facebook, forums or things like that. So really giving them a space to demonstrate what they're doing and the ways in which they're thinking, that, should they be challenged, they can be like, go take a look. Like, this is what I'm doing. Like, it's not just fluff, as the perception may be. So I started to do that. I moved into this idea of extra credit options, and And so as I talk about open pedagogy, and we'll have a definition later on, for me a core piece of this is moving out of the frame of you will show me how you have learned in this class in ways that are just particular to what I want, versus there are lots of different ways in which you can demonstrate your learning. And I am open to engaging with those and figuring those out, kind of co-creating those types of assessments with students so that they have the opportunity to think about how they can show their learning and how I can make sure that they are meeting the objectives of the course. And so I started doing a lot of extra, or creating kind of a menu option of extra credit that would make sure they're still meeting the objectives and can do these either alternative assignments or additive assignments if they were slipping elsewhere. Added on to that in 2017, I went a little bit further and started to really think about, well, how can my students engage with or learn from other students? And so that out of that came these two projects, the annotations, where I've created these learning guides for the course, and now each semester part of the students' optional assignments is they can go in and provide annotations. They can add to those learning guides, so that the learning guides I had in 2017 aren't the same ones I have today, because they've been informed by students. They've been enhanced by other students in what they're taking from the readings and the things they're playing around with. The other piece of that is, in this particular course, I have 10 weeks of kind of content that I've created and lessons that I've created, and then the last 4, or it's let's see, 9 weeks, 4 weeks. Am I doing the math on this right? No, sorry. It's 10 weeks and then 4 weeks of case studies, and then the last week is wrap up. But the case studies are opportunities for us to take everything we've done in the first 10 weeks and to kind of dive deep into a particular area or arena of pop culture. So we do horror comics and censorship in the 1950s. You know, these are ones that I've created. We've done post 9/11 zombie films. We've done fandoms. We've done consumerism in pop culture. So those are the ones I've come up with. But I started allowing as a final project for students to create those modules, those case studies. So now I have about 6 or 7 modules, the 4 that I created, and then two and a half. The half one probably won't get used again, but at least 2 that definitely will and are used by students, or students get to vote on which case studies they want to use. So they might use some of mine, but they often gravitate towards one on the topic is political. What was it? Music and political. Not revolution, but rebellion, there we go, in 1970s music. So that's something I would have never picked, because that's not my area of pop culture, but I love the fact that now because the student did this case study and I've better understood and learned and kind of expanded my knowledge, it's now another piece of the course that students can engage in. So, and then last year, because I don't want this to all be, sunshine and butterflies, last year I did what I called the DIY option, and it failed miserably. Not so miserable that I won't try it again, but it definitely, as I talk about the advice later on, is something I would come back to and really need to give a lot more thought to. And the idea was that from within that was starting at day 1 with the students and pitching to them, how do you want to learn? Let's create our own pathway. And the reason that it failed was largely because even though they're creating their own pathway, I didn't create a good structure for them to go down that pathway. So that's something that was on me, but I also knew it was a risk going into it, and students knew it was a risk going into it. So didn't go well, but I also don't want to paint this as like everything goes perfect and smooth the first time. That's usually never the case. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of what I've really enjoyed about doing with popular culture and a lot of the benefits. So if you can go to the next slide, the first thing I really love about doing open pedagogy is that there's so much stuff to benefit from, that I feel like there's so many opportunities for students to get into the material in ways that they have not before. And the way I can best describe this is, our traditional way of dealing with learning is, the instructor pours out a bunch of content, or the instructor sends the student to a text, even a video, and that's a really one-sided interaction. I give you this book, you read it and try to absorb it, and I'm going to quiz you or do some kind of assessment to make sure you do it, versus thinking about other ways that they can engage. And the usual question there is like, well, what does that look like? Well, we can't even think about it because we've been so used to that format of I look at the book and I look at the book and you look at the book and then I assess your expectation of the book or the video or the podcast. So this to me it opens up a lot of more options. And so that also brings me to the next one of next slide of options for students. And options around what they can read, what they can engage with, what kind of activities or assignments. So I have a lot more content, a lot more means of engaging with content, and a lot more opportunities for students to demonstrate their learning. And for me, that's important. I think I know, like, I'm a nerd, right? I have way more degrees than most people should. Like, I have 3 masters and I'm working on a doctorate because I have an addiction, but nobody will call it that because it looks good. It comes with degrees instead of problems, besides, student debt. But like, I really enjoy what I'm learning. I really enjoy reading and literature and things like that. But American Literature 1, one of the courses that I teach, is dry as all can be. Like, I get why it's important, but trying to communicate how important some of these texts are to students that live in the world today, when the prose feels so inaccessible, for me, it's about thinking about, well, how can they still show me that they're learning and they're trying to make sense of these things in ways that are demonstrating the objectives and also getting their interest. So a good example is in my literature course, the American Literature course, I restructured it in a way so that students could select the readings every week. Because I rather than going from text to text or doing chronological, I went by genre. And by moving it to genre, I mean, I had this one student who, he was a fisherman up in Gloucester. I say up in Gloucester, although I'm north of Gloucester right now. But he was a fisherman. So in all of the readings, he was always able to find a couple readings that talked about maritime culture. And so he went through and he selected all of these things as we were reading week to week. And so much of what he was able to do was break down the literature from this lens of maritime culture in a way that would never have naturally happened within the course. And then from that, he was able to do some really interesting final project that demonstrated both his passion for maritime culture and his ability to really connect and interpret and analyze literature. So like that, and he stopped hating American literature. I mean, he's not a huge fan, but he's not like, oh, you'll never touch that, or I don't want anything to do with that. But he feels more connected with it. So that idea of giving them options. The other thing I really like, or another really big benefit for me, was this idea of instant replay. And so much, if we want to go to the next slide, so much of what we do, particularly when using Open Pedagogy, OER resources, and the like, is you get to rewind the tape. Live classroom is great, but if that material can also be captured in some way in an online environment, or whether it's video or audio, the idea that they can revisit the materials, the idea that they can interact with them rather than in this isolated one opportunity. So like right now we're recording so that other people can watch it. I'm somebody who has some hearing challenges. It's actually it's my dyslexia that acts out. So if there's ambient noise, if I'm not sitting up front, if the person has a strong accent, or there's something in between us like a door, I'm around the corner, or I was on the phone, I have a lot of trouble hearing. So I always have closed captions on. I always, if I can watch something recorded, I'm going to opt to, because I'll be able to hear it better. I can put it up to my ear versus, have to like strain, or I'm the person who'll be like, wait, can you say that again? And I think I said that to several people already today. So this idea of instant replay, really opening up the options for those students, or giving them the opportunity to re-engage in different ways than what we tend to think of as the traditional way. The other thing that as I mentioned about creating the case studies and stuff, the other big benefit on the next slide is really, I mean, and this is true both with pop culture and American literature, there's just this ever-growing expanse of materials. Now, there's materials that are, these are the things we want to select from, but here are these great, you know, secondary resources or recommended materials and stuff. But it's this idea of, you know, I have a bigger pool of really cool things to select from. Some of that is student created. And I love that idea of having student created work that's teaching future students, because it makes it more grounded in those students' experiences. So I'll talk a little bit later. You know, I have students do audio narrations of short stories as one of their potential assignments. And because this happens semester after semester, more and more of the stories that we have to read now have audio narrations. Now, again, as I said, I have hearing issues, but I love audiobooks. Like, that is my dominant form of learning. I listen to, in a given year, probably about 150 to 180 audiobooks. I kind of devour them like candy. I don't know why, I just really enjoy that. So that was always something I wanted to have in the classroom. And now I've created this kind of range of audio materials for my students, because I think, again, American literature is a great example. It's very inaccessible in terms of students getting the feel and the vibe. And one of the biggest challenges for me always reading was, well, I can't get the tone. I don't understand the tone. And it took me 7 tries of reading The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and then listening to it to understand, like, oh, this is dry British sci-fi humor. If somebody had just explained that or read that to me in that tone, I would have got it the first time. But the first, 6 times I picked it up, I was just like, why is everybody telling me to read this book? It sounds like I can't make sense of it. So this idea of audio narration, or creating these richer materials for students to process, to learn, and to benefit from. And coupled with that is that the next benefit is this idea that we can have both breadth and depth, right? Because if by creating these materials and having students kind of jump into or dive down certain holes, like, we get those students who really hook onto something and go deep with that. And if they're producing things that other students then can learn from, those become learning objects in the course that you can have, that you can put there in the LMS. Your learning management system, I forget, is it here? Is it Canvas, right? So you can start to organize those materials and have those there for those that want to go deeper. But that doesn't necessarily mean everybody has to go deeper, right? Some are going to want to really, focus in. Like that student I had, I would have never really thought about the maritime theme in American, like, I know it's there in capacities, but I would have never pursued that. But now I had a student who did, and now brought that to my attention enough to think about, well, what are other themes that students will start to gravitate towards? So I want to talk a little bit more now about the specifics of my course. Those are just kind of like the big picture items. But as I've said, my course entailed a lot of choices and options. And they were largely around kind of the activities they could do, and then also the assignments. And so we would have, the weekly activities in which there were things that they had to do, but they had choice within them. Then they had an article assignment where they would basically do a book review. I often frame it as a book review of an academic article on pop culture. It's actually something I do in all of my classes, is have them go and get an academic article on something within the course and write like a 2-page essay on it, kind of what sense they make of it. And then they had the course projects, and there's 2 of them. The What is Pop Culture, which is more, it's more of the generic assignment where they have to kind of grapple with the course material, go out and do certain activities, and they have choice within that. But it's pretty limited versus the case study where they're actually producing something that's going to be used and applied in that course. And then, of course, the extra credit. So if we go to the next slide, the article assignment, as I mentioned, it really gives them an opportunity to go and find something about pop culture, but also demonstrate to other students like how vast pop culture is as a topic to study. Again, I do this in every course that I've taught. So American literature, history, we always do this assignment because it gives people a sense of, I often tell them, go and find something you're interested in, but related to the discipline of the course. So in American literature, it's like, go and see what's written on literature and cars. Like, go see, there's going to be an academic article out there, right? Because that's what we do. We write interesting articles on all sorts of cool things. So then there's also, as I mentioned on the next slide, is the selections for readings. And so I want to make sure students are doing the readings or identifying what readings they're doing. And so I've used a very simple Google Sheet. So each week, the week before they're doing whatever readings that they're doing, they fill out the Google Sheet. And half the time, I don't necessarily check the Google Sheet. The Google Sheet is more of a nudge to them to help them to plan. Like, oh, I've got to fill this out. I've got to decide, what readings am I doing? What videos do I want to watch? And so I think this is the one used for my Western, for the week that we do on the Western and the Cowboy. And so within that, they're selecting an academic article that they'll read, and then primary sources. So they might choose from dime novels. They might choose from Westerns on Western movies or Western TV shows that are on YouTube. I offer old-time radio Westerns. So there's a wide variety of sources that they can kind of choose from and think about what they want to do with that. And then the next, as I mentioned before, is blogging. And with blogging, here's that opportunity. They get these interesting posts. They're often trying to apply the theoretical things. So pop culture, there's a variety of theories that are used. So they're often being introduced to those through videos that I've created, and then trying to apply them to some area of pop culture and try to make sense of how you use that theory. And so it's kind of this really interesting practice space to think about theory, which for many students is hard. It's hard for me, never mind my students. But it gives this really good opportunity to kind of play. And so I often think of this as the blog as a playground, which I think has always been a really useful space, or always thought of the blog as a place to kind of flesh out thoughts more than to produce perfectly, well-polished prose. Like that's what we often think of for more formal publications. As I mentioned on the next slide, I've talked about extra credit, and so they'll have different opportunities to find additional really interesting resources on pop culture, and not just like, oh, here's this interesting article, but here's this interesting archive of, movie posters from Russia, right? Like there's all sorts of really cool things being put out there. So again, this becomes something for them to create and share, but it also becomes something for me to use to find new things for future classes. So I might go on there and find some really interesting images that have now been, I wouldn't have found without the students finding this strange, or I shouldn't say strange, it's a really fascinating database of Russian movie posters. And then on the next slide, as I mentioned, this is what the annotation, at least kind of the first round, what they do around the learning guides is the learning guides I've created are in Google Docs. I allow for commenting. So students go in and they start to add, or they'll highlight certain sections and provide either a new take, a new resource, a new way of framing it, bring in something else from one of the readings. And so we'll have a discussion on the side of the learning guide. I might ask them to give me a little bit more context or to flesh something out. And then the next time that I teach it, I go and I take all of those comments and I integrate them into the learning guide and cite my students, right? I cite them however they want to be cited. So some are fine with their names. Others will say, no, you can just say a student. Others will say, we'll make up some name and I'll make sure it's known that it's a pseudonym. So people aren't like, why do you have, James Bond in your class? But it is a really nice way for them to do more, think more about the learning, and it creates that conversational piece that we've often seen in a face-to-face environment, but also giving the students time to reflect and think about it and not necessarily have to do it on the spot. On the next slide, here's that, as I said, that pop culture, what is pop culture project? And again, this goes pretty quickly. This is kind of infused with different choices. So it's not, again, just you have to write me an essay on X. It's I want you to think about what pop culture is, but I want you to explore it by going through and doing, your choice of assignments. So one assignment might be to do a close reading of a film before 1950. Another activity they can do is to attend a pop culture event. And that can be everything from a sports game at a bar to an actual live sports game to a concert. I have students that go to anime conventions and stuff because March is pretty huge in the convention circuit in Boston because you have, let's see, PAX East, which is like video games, a video game pop culture conference. You have Anime Boston. You used to have Boston Comic Con, but there's like 2 or 3 that are in the area. And so students can go to that as their homework most of them, the ones that sign up for this are already going to do it, or already have tickets, but they can use that as a means of like an anthropological study of like, what do they see going on? How are people interacting? What is the meaning making going on here? And then bring that into their paper and their discussion. And then on the next slide, this is the case study, and very similar, it's broken down into smaller points so that there's this continual discussion with students. It's this ongoing conversation and development of their either their case study or what is popular culture. As they submit, I give feedback, and so there's smaller pieces that eventually build up to the full paper or the full case study. And then, as I said, on the next slide is the DIY pitch, which went really south this year, and again, it was poor planning on my behalf, and had nothing to do with the students and more with how I executed it. I would have tried it again this year, but I found out within days that the semester was starting a week earlier than it had in the last 20 years, so that kind of threw me for a loop. They decided to start before MLK after 20 years of starting after MLK, so that left me a little frustrated, or at least catching up and not really being able to build the infrastructure, and that'll be something I'll talk about shortly around kind of best tips regarding that. So if we can go to the next slide, so all of this that I've been talking about is what I would consider open pedagogy. And for me, open pedagogy is really this opportunity to look for looking for opportunities in which students can engage in learning content in ways that either within the course or beyond. Look at the learning content, look at the learning activities, and have a bit more malleability, have a bit more opportunity to play a role in crafting, framing, improving, or finding better resources, as well as looking at their activities and thinking about them as not one-offs, right? So one of the things that I see happening a lot, and I've done this in my own classes, and this experience, in all of my various education, is we get these assignments, and the assignments are there strictly to prove we meet the objective, whatever it is the instructor wants us. And sometimes that's really useful, but really pushing the course activities to develop something that allows for students to take that elsewhere. So not just the 5-paragraph essay just to prove you could write a 5-paragraph essay, but a 5-paragraph essay or a writing sample that can be used for something else. And sometimes it's simply framing it as, I want you to write an opt-ed, and I want you to submit it somewhere, or I encourage you to submit it somewhere. But really thinking about, how do we make sure what students are doing has a longer lifeline than just for this class? Because I'm assuming other people have had, maybe you don't have them anymore, because it's the digital age and I could scan it all, but how many people have like papers that they wrote from classes long ago, and you're like, oh, I wrote this and I've never done anything with it before. And we have, if we mounted that up, we'd have, large stacks of papers. And I think for me it's a little different. One of my career trajectories is I'm a writer, and so I'm often looking to repurpose. But I don't think we empower our students to do that enough, to think about and look at these activities as not just demonstrations of their learning, but opportunities to do something more with. Now, again, I'm not going to say you need to do this first of all, I'm not going to say you need to do this. This is just something that I found extremely valuable and enriching in my teaching and learning experience, but it isn't something that I would say is necessary for all things in the course, but starting to look at your different course activities and thinking about, can I move this beyond one and done? So there's a couple really great people that talk about open pedagogy, and if we can go to the next slide, here are just two of them. What I like is Maha Bali, who, if you are on Twitter, definitely follow her. She's phenomenal to enjoy. But on the next slide, she has created this really great curation of the discussion or the development of open pedagogy. So if you're kind of looking at where, is that the next slide? I messed up, I'm sorry. I jumped 2 slides ahead. We'll get to them in a sec. But so this is what I was talking about before, this idea of the disposable assignment, right? So the disposable assignment in this idea of they're doing something just to be ultimately thrown away. Rethinking your course activities or some course activities to have a longer life. And we'll look at some examples of that in a moment. But what I want to do is just briefly mention more on open pedagogy. So the next slide, this time it'll switch to the right one. There we go. Maha Bali is the one that I was talking about, who, first of all, is phenomenal on Twitter, and second, has this great curation of different people talking about. You can get kind of a de facto sense of the different takes on open pedagogy, because like so many other academics, we all have our different flavor or different emphasis. And so my emphasis on open pedagogy has a lot to do with leveraging open educational resources to this opportunity of creating activities in which you're not disposing of assignments, or you're limiting how many assignments are just to meet the objective versus can expand students' opportunities, or expand their skill set, or demonstrate beyond the classroom. But what I like about Bali's post is she identifies as, there's also this whole discourse of open pedagogy as an open web, and rethinking how people teach their entire course. And so she's done some really cool things of having a very open public course that she's teaching that is just fascinating to follow. And then Tanis Morgan has a really good but brief kind of history of open pedagogy as a concept. So I'm going to take a little bit. I know we're going to have questions at the end, but before I go too further, questions before we move forward?
I have one quick question.
Sure. Next slide.
Sometimes when students, when you give them too many options, they feel a little overwhelmed.
Yes.
And they sort of, like, I want to be told what to do.
Yes.
That sort of thing. So how have students reacted to being given the choice to go in different directions in your course and to help create the content?
Mm-hmm. So the quick and dirty answer is they haven't at times. And if I had had the choice, or if I had had that extra week, one of the things I was planning to add to the course was kind of like the straight and narrow path, where all decisions are pre-decided and you just make that one decision once. So that would be my short answer. Beyond that, I think the important piece is planning. So as I showed, I went through this very slowly. In other words, it wasn't all that, I didn't do this all at once. And so there is this idea of slow integration. And so a lot of these choices it's not all on day one where you have to decide all things, but slowly as you go along, here's where the decision points are. When I run into students that are like, I don't want to decide, depending on what it is, I'll say, okay, then you do what is popular culture, and you just pick the first options as they come along. Something like the article analysis, because that is tied to actual research, like they're doing research, I push them a little further and be like, but having to go through a database and find an article on something that, on something specific, that is a skill of the course. So you have less choice on being able to say, just give me an article and I'll write a review, because the process of choosing is part of the assessment. But that is a good point, and it's something that I would say you would want to, and what I'm hoping to do the next time I run a similar course, is to have a kind of, here's your one choice, everything's chosen out except in areas where choice is part of the assessment.
And just in case, since we didn't have a mic, my question was, are students often overwhelmed by being given too many choices? That's what Lance just answered.
Cool. All right. Then any other questions before we move forward? All right, then I'm going to go with a few more examples of types of open pedagogical assignments and activities. So one is Wikipedia, in using that, having students go and create entries or overhaul or reassess entries. And it's wonderful in many different ways. Faculty are often uncomfortable using Wikipedia. The first thing I would say is go there and check out their educational materials, because they're really good at, because faculty have been doing this now, I mean, you could say for a decade. Wikipedia has been around for about 15 years, and it's been at least a decade that they've been doing this in large significant enough that they've had these resources. But what I like about this is it is both an activity that makes the students think about public writing, it makes them think about collaborative writing, and it makes them think about kind of the stability lack slash instability of knowledge online. Now, people have all sorts of issues with Wikipedia, but the one thing Wikipedia has that the New York Times or most other sites don't have is a full history of every single change ever made to every article. And that's a really interesting thing to have, given how easily things can be changed. And there's a pretty, I'll say, people are always concerned, well, you can go on there and say anything. I mean, I've gone on, not too often, because if you do, they ban you, or they ban your IP address, but I've gone on just to prove the point to people, where like, I've gone on to the, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and added, in the description a subplot where aliens show up and all, like this whole ridiculous thing, and it's gone within an hour. Now, yes, somebody within that hour may have thought Huck Finn had something to do with aliens, but the idea is that, there's a history of that change, of it being changed initially and then also being unchanged, and that they're pretty good at getting in there. Now, beyond that, there's questions about, well, how much of it is biased? There's a strong argument about it being overwhelmingly American-focused, overwhelmingly male-focused, and those are valid arguments. But then it's not, the response isn't to avoid it altogether, but then to think about, well, then maybe if you are crafting an assignment, you say, okay, add, if you're teaching a course on chemistry and you want people, maybe it's the history of chemistry, go and add prominent female chemists to Wikipedia because they're absent, or those particular articles are like 2 sentences versus, the male chemist, there's like pages and pages and pages. So it's a really great opportunity for them to really think about, in that idea of digital literacy, grappling with it, engaging with it, as opposed to avoiding it and not thinking about it as critically. The next example is the one that I'm a big fan of. I mentioned before, creating audio narrations. So if you teach literature, actually a variety of subjects, LIBRIVOX is a really cool site. It's run by volunteers. And the idea is that they find works that are in the public domain, and they create audio narrations that are now in MP3 format that are now in the public domain. And they have a fascinating collection. So like they've got a lot of classics. They've got all sorts of, they've got Shakespeare, and they've got Chaucer and, Mark Twain and stuff. And then they have other random things like Gray's Anatomy, which like blows my mind. I'm like, but I feel like that's a more visual text, but it's on there as an audio. Somebody has taken the time to create that. They have all sorts of poetry and stuff, and so it's all run by volunteers. And in my literature course, particularly American Literature 1, I have this theme of the American voice. The expanding of it, who gets to speak, who doesn't get to speak, who gets to be heard, whose texts are read at the time, and whose texts have to be rediscovered later. And so this is a really interesting analogy in which they are literally giving voice to written texts and integrating that into the course material. They're reading things that later students are also now going to get to hear, and it's put up on this website for other people to take advantage of. So I see a bunch of people like, I need to check that site out. It's Federalist Papers. What? Yeah, right. They have the Federalist Papers. That's the thing. Like, you can find the Declaration of Independence. You'll find all sorts of interesting things. So it is a really great. It's a great resource for teaching and learning, but it's also something you can have your students contribute to. On the next slide, some additional examples, right? So I chunked these into 3 different categories. The first is student opportunities. And within that, these are things that I think I frame as having tangible benefits to the students. That is, activities that are going to benefit them moving forward, that they can use or demonstrate to beyond the classroom, beyond the classroom. So the first is e-portfolios, and this varies from school to school. I will say right now, even though it's been about a decade, we're still in I'd say the infant stage of e-portfolios, because ultimately the idea is that an institution as a whole takes an e-portfolio, and all the courses that the student may take have something that they could potentially put into that e-portfolio. So it has to be a systematic thing, but if you are an institution that is at that point, the idea that students can take different pieces. Now, again, this is similar, you see this more in art schools or even music schools where, like, yes, they have a portfolio of things that they can demonstrate. But this idea of having it available online, something that they can easily drop into, as they're applying for positions, or when somebody's doing a Google search and all of a sudden they come up with this portfolio of work that student has done around a particular topic. That's one thing I tend to also like about open pedagogy and having students create these types of things is we know between when they put in the application for a job and when they get the phone interview, there's the Google search. And doing things like this and helping them create a digital footprint that is connected to their major, connected to their education, connected to them demonstrating, thoughtful contributions or ideas, putting those out there and increasing that digital footprint versus their digital footprint of, what they did this past weekend, or what, their Instagram account or the like anything we can do to help them be thinking about that or pushing them in that direction, I think is a really good opportunity for us and for them. The next one is certifications. And again, this will varies with mileage. All of these vary with mileage. But certifications, there's some institutions, there's some programs where, I think the best example is there's a couple institutions that I'm at that have the access to the website Lynda, or lynda.com, which is this really robust place of all sorts of resources around. It's a lot of technology, but it's also a lot of other new things that they have on there, like speaking, speech, APA formatting, and they're really great video, I say video and that really undersells it. They're cut up into very small 1 to 2 minute chunks, but those are put together as courses. And if you complete a course, you get a certificate of completion, right? So thinking about, well, are there things that Lynda has that are relevant to your course, but now also create this certificate of completion that they can then use somewhere else. And so one of the examples I have is, one of the examples I see is like if you have them doing actually, the course I've seen it used with, I have a faculty member who is teaching search engine optimization. And Google has this whole certification program that's free to learn how to do search engine optimization. And sure enough, he has them complete that. Because first of all, if you're doing search engine optimization, Google is probably one of the big places you want to study. And so you get the course and the credits for the course, but you also walk out of that course with a certification that you can put on your resume, that you can say as you're going to apply for jobs around marketing and the like, well, yeah, I've taken courses on this and I also have the Google certification. Other examples are just kind of being aware of or encouraging students to, or creating assignments that help them think about repurposing. This is one I came to this past semester in a course I was taking, where we had 2 options for an assignment. One was to write 2 policy papers, and the other was to write a book review. And I read lots of books, so I was just like, and I review a lot, so I went for the book review. And as a result, it got me thinking, because I ended up reviewing a book from 1942. It's really exciting. It was actually on higher education, and everything in the book, like all the problems that the person points to, I was just like, oh, I feel like I'm reading Inside Higher Ed. So what I did was I rolled that into, and it's something I'm working on right now, a potential blog series for Inside Higher Ed about doing book reviews of old books to see what are the problems that they're talking about and how many of those are we still talking about. So really thinking about assignments as opportunities or framing them to students as things they should either setting them up to be able to do it or encouraging them to do it. Whether it's the letter to the editor, the op-ed, pitch for a blog series. In the pop culture course, this is much easier because there's lots of places to write about pop culture. But I think again, because the internet is the internet, there's always going to be a niche where students could take some of these as an opportunity. Even interviews. So in my course, one of the optional assignments is doing an interview and interviewing somebody that in some way is connected to pop culture. So often I'll have students that are interviewing, comic book store owners or people that run like a pretty advanced fantasy sports league type thing, like more of So like they interview some interesting people, and so I encourage them, A, to use that as a means of networking, but B, to also think about, is there some place that would find this a really cool thing to publish or to talk about? So those are really kind of the ones that I think about in terms of student opportunities. If we go to the next slide, we have what I consider course-centered opportunities. And I will go through this really quickly. So here we have, we're talking about opportunities around like the course wiki and creating a wiki in which students can create knowledge that is then copied into the next course. And that's the big thing. There's a lot of wikis out there within the LMS, but it usually means each semester you copy it over and it completely is deleted. I would encourage looking at wiki tools that allow you to copy last semester so that it's ever growing as opposed to having to hit reset. And then going down to the next area, I would just also want to mention kind of the globally focused, and that's where we get into things around like citizen science, right? So if you're teaching science courses, looking at things where students can actually produce things that are helping others. And there's a lot of great citizen science programs out there, or crowdsourcing opportunities where you actually get students helping out in archives. I've seen that work really successfully. And then open knowledge projects similar to Wikipedia, but there's definitely others out there. And then also playing around with or increasing the open educational resources out there. So I'm actually going to skip the next two slides and just real quickly going with some tips as we're running towards the end of the time. The first is, as you're thinking about this, the first is, are you doing something like this already? Because sometimes you are and you don't even realize it. So it's worth kind of labeling it that, or at least acknowledging that. I always recommend just start with one thing, just one. Do not try to be like, I'm going to reformat all my assignments. That is a path of madness. Always be looking at this with this eye towards your objectives and realizing whatever objective you have, it can almost always be assessed in more ways than one. And that can kind of lead you down the path of how to do that. The other is kind of looking at and seeing, are you or can you use OER, open educational resources, and then align that with the open pedagogy, allowing students to really manipulate and use stuff. And then talk with your colleagues, find out what they're doing, borrow guidelines, borrow setups. Like, I put out my stuff a lot so that other people can use it, so they don't have to start at, let me start with a brand new thing. Borrow and adapt. And then finally, really make sure you tell your students what you're doing. Explain that you're doing this. You're doing open pedagogy as a means of helping them produce more, not have to feel like they're doing something just to hop through a hoop, but to be able to do and demonstrate their learning beyond. So I think that is all for now. So how about questions?
Yeah, thanks so much, Lance. I think you've given us lots to think about. So I did want to pass the mic to people who have questions.
Hey, thanks so much. That was great. I assume that you have your students submit all of this stuff digitally, and so it persists in some form. And could you do this if you weren't using an LMS or some similar? Or what are the advantages of using an LMS to do this kind of open pedagogy?
I love that comes from the instructional technologist.
It's a loaded question.
Right. All of my assignments are ultimately digital. If they're writing a paper, I'm still going to take it digitally because that's how I'm going to do feedback through comments and things like that. So before the more modern LMS, which allowed you to do a lot of notating on the document itself without having to download it, right? So I think Canvas does that. I know Blackboard does, so does Moodle, where you don't even have to download it and do the annotating in Microsoft Word and then re-upload it. You can now do it within the browser. So I rely heavily on the LMS. If I didn't, I'd still take everything digitally because it's more time consuming for me to be writing comments. it's more taxing to students to try to read my comments. I write like a 2-year-old, and that will never change. Whereas my comments, when they're typed, are much clearer. I can also give more interesting feedback. So I've also gone into doing video feedback, where I just, I have use Screencast-O-Matic and put their paper up there, and I just kind of talk through the different points in the paper. So it would always be digital, but I like the fact that with the LMS, most of it is all within there. Some things aren't. So the blog is not within the LMS, and so I have to have one tab with the blog open and one tab with the gradebook open. Yep.
Good morning.
Hello.
Lots of interesting ideas. My question is, you talked about students doing a wiki for the class.
Mm-hmm.
Could you go into a little more depth there?
Absolutely. So wikis can be done in different ways. One is kind of like the course notebook, which I think can, depending on the course, might be really interesting. I tend to think of it as, you're creating the web of knowledge within that course. And so the first time you do it, students may, and again, you can think about this in terms of, do you want them to dive deeper into what you've already covered, or do you want them to cover things that aren't covered in the course directly, kind of offshoots? And it may be both, or you may start with the first 2 times they dive deep. Then by the 3rd time, because you've got all those topics covered deeply as kind of this collective, like, here are the things we're learning, here's the things we're pulling in, then the 3rd time you're doing it, you might have students do more offshoots, or here's things we can't get to. So I would look at it as kind of collecting the crowd wisdom over semester to semester and how you can accumulate that, and allow for students to provide tips or provide insights of like what resources worked and things like that.
And are they putting themselves down as authors, and how are you grading that?
So this is where it gets a little tricky. The first is, and this is where, like, in some learning management systems, it will actually show you like not just who put in what, but like what percentage they've put in. And so that makes it easier to grade, but then you can't copy it over semester to semester. So what it does mean is kind of creating some rubric around what a contribution looks like. And just going in and kind of, and ultimately you're going to end up using a wiki tool that isn't part of an LMS, because all of the LMS wikis are set to restart. So it is a little more, it's similar to as I talked about with the blog, where like I'll have to have a tab open of the wiki and then a tab of the grading of the grading column and bounce back and forth student to student. But any good wiki is going to show you who's done what, or you'll be able to do some breakdown of that. Or it's certainly something to look for in choosing which wiki tool.
Right. Thanks.
Thank you. One of the things I find really attractive about your suggestion, or at least what I think you're suggesting, is that we identify the goals, but the student identifies how to get there. And they identify the path. And this gets, I have 2 questions though about it, and one of them gets back to Paul's point. It assumes a student body that is highly motivated and curious. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to working with students who may not be as curious and motivated as we might wish. The second point is one of our responsibilities is to have students expand their capabilities in areas of comfort. And I wonder about the danger is too strong a word, but the concern about students going back to what they know as the path, rather than getting out of their comfort zone. I don't want to impose the path on them, but I also don't want them to take paths that are well trod already. I want them to leave here with more skills and areas of comfort than they began. So if you can address those 2, at least briefly, I'd appreciate it.
So the first one is, so the first question just around this idea of what about students that aren't, say, engaged or curious or motivated?
Yeah, that idea of curiosity, I mean, that there's some degree of self-motivation here.
Yes. So what I would say to that, just they're going to be more motivated and curious when they have choice versus when it's, you've just got to learn this because I said so. So I think there's that piece to understand, and I think that for me really was experienced with that student who came into the class as like, I don't care about American literature, but really loved maritime culture. And so because he had that choice and was still meeting those objectives, he met something he didn't like, but he was able to find the thing that was motivating in it.
There was a hook there.
Right, but that hook was self-generated. That was not something I would have been able to show him, or like I wouldn't have known him enough in the first few weeks to be like, oh, you definitely need to read, definitely focus on X, Y, Z. He pulled that out of himself. So I think that's one piece. Is it's hard for us. We start our course, we've got 20 people. If it's a face-to-face course, in that first session, we might have, if it's an hour, we might have, 3 minutes to maybe get to know each student. And that's assuming we have the full, So it's very hard for us to figure that. So I think by allowing for choice, it breaks them out of, particularly in courses in which they don't like. Again, I teach I've taught history, I've taught literature. Like these are the ones where it's right up there with math, and where people come in and like, I can't do this, or I hate history. It's just facts and all that. So I think that's one thing. Is it then gives them an avenue of their own choosing to get into it. So that becomes more motivating than the just, I'm going to choose these things and they're important because I said they are. I mean, there's truth in that, but that front-on attack puts up more walls and barriers than the, okay, how do you want to get on this road? So I would say that, and at the end of the day, it's not a cure-all. Nothing ever is, but I've just found there's more. The ones who are less likely to are a little bit more motivated, and I think that's I've seen that happen enough compared to when I wasn't doing these things that it makes me feel like that's an important piece. And a lot of the research around learning and kind of the role of being having some choice and some motivation. So there's that piece, and I'm sorry, just quick remind me of the second half was the...
Using the same, so for example, somebody who might blog, always choosing to blog as among the choices that you have.
So what I would say to that is, I mean, so pop culture is a great example. Within that, like, they can only blog so much. It's not going to be all of their assignments. So there's still variety. Now, could they come forward and say, I would like to propose, my entire, like, if they came to me and said, I want to do the entire course as a blog, that in itself, I might say yes to, but it would be a conversation about, well, how are you going to meet these objectives? And so I would say, so it's two things. One is, it's always going back to the objectives. And therefore, if you find yourself saying, but that's not meeting this other piece, then it might mean coming back to your objectives and saying, do I need this other piece? Is this other piece part of the learning experience within this course? Or not everybody's going to use this type of approach to teaching and learning. So I know ultimately, whatever I'm doing in my class is not necessarily repeat. I mean, I hear from plenty of students like, I've never done anything like this before. This is weird. This is strange. Like, I know it's an approach that will not be universally accepted. And so they're inevitably going to run into those harder walls, or those things that are, you can't blog this entire course. You're going to have to write the 5-paragraph essay just for the sake of writing a 5-paragraph essay. So I think it's that mixture. It's recognizing the objectives, and is the student able to meet the objectives? And within that, just my own awareness, are there ways in which I'll still push the student, or in our negotiation, find a way to introduce other things? So maybe they can blog, but they're going to have to be a little bit more flexible. They're going to have to do at least one video within that blog series, or they're going to have to do certain things that expand just the traditional blog writing.
In a similar vein with content, say you're taking a course on neuroscience, I mean, there's stuff you have to learn.
Yes.
And you just can't go off and, do your own thing. Right?
So you're absolutely right. So you're going to have courses where there's definitely a certain, it must cover X, Y, Z. The only thing I would say to that, so that's absolutely true. The only thing I would say is, the traditional method of courses like that, though, is I think of nursing, because some of the schools that I've been at have big nursing programs, is, okay, we have 15 weeks to cram in what really should take a year to cram in. And even think of that word, that, the words that they use, cram, right? Like, it's, that is that banking model of education, where it's like, let me open your skull and cram in all of this information. So there's already within that an assumption of pushing through it just to push through it, that, I mean, certainly fails a significant portion of students. And, we treat it like a live or die, or like you either make it or you don't. But we also know everything we know about learning tells us that's not a healthy model. So my thought would be, in those courses like neuroscience or like really heavy stuff, I'm not saying, completely go your own path, but there's still definitely ways of thinking about how are we making sure they're learning effectively and they are engaging in the learning. Because I think you're going to find some students are going to learn better because they can navigate some of that a little bit more than what the tradition is, which is, I'm going to lecture, you're going to read 15 chapters a week, and you're going to take these assessments to know whether you know it or not, even though all of that may not be the best form of assessment. In some of this, we're just limited by the way in which education is structured, and we're not going to certainly change that here. But I think there's still, within that course, I think there would be opportunities to be a little more thoughtful about the open pedagogical process.
You have examples of everything, like your annotations, your wikis, online, don't you? Somewhere?
Usually in these slides, I have slide decks like this that are out there pretty substantively, usually on my blog. I think on my website, I haven't put them up again recently, but on SlideShare, the documents themselves, I believe you can find through search.
Yeah, I remember initially when we were looking at having you come here, we had a ton of stuff shared with us. So
yep.
If anyone is wondering, oh, what does the wiki look like, I remember seeing examples of it provided. I just wanted to ask you, like with weekly activities, just being an example, your model, some might say, I'm just going to be blunt, seems like a lot of work.
Yep. So yes, yes it is, and yes it does. I think some of this is, again, that approach that I showed at the beginning of, I slowly put this together. So as I figured out what works, I started to, integrate things, and I got comfortable. I also, built up for many of these kind of a can of comments. And so I go into, I was doing this before I got here really early, because I didn't get the message until I was already en route. But I was doing grading, and what I do is I open up kind of just a file of, these are comments that I've had related to Module 2 discussion over the years that I've been doing it. And so I read the students' posts, and I just kind of grab a few different things and pop them in. It's a lot of copy and paste, and then kind of identifying something specific that I saw, something more specific, like I really liked how you discussed XYZ that they actually discussed, kind of thing. So some of it I've streamlined, and it's just kind of been integrated. Some of it is a little bit more work, and that that means more time, and we're always stressed for time. But I've found I've just gotten better results. I've found, doing video feedback. Again, initially I was a little bit clumsy with it, trying to figure it all out. But once I got it and I've got the rhythm down, I also know when students can hear my voice, especially in an online course, when they can hear my voice going over their paper versus their own internalized, anxious prone around their writing, versus me saying, I really like this, I thought this could have used a little work, versus this could have used a little, like, that results in students not just hearing what I have to say, but being willing to revise, or feeling like, oh, I'm in good hands, like I can move forward in this class. And that's some of the, I think it's resulted in enough changes for me that it's worth my time. And that's not to say, if you don't, it's not worth your time. I recognize we all have a bajillion demands, but I've found the trade-off has been worth it.
Just one more thing. You said you've had community college students, and you've been at Brandeis. So can you maybe provide a comparison of how they take to some of these kinds of open
pedagogy exercises?
So I'm an instructional designer at Brandeis. I haven't taught there, but I've taught at Salem State University, UMass, Lowell, Emerson. I find less variation, even though you see different pockets of students. I think it's more, the challenge is often around certain courses and the expectation of it being a challenging course. Because I've taught courses on monsters, popular culture, comics, and these are not courses people take with a, they take it with a sense of, this will be easy, and that's usually more what I'm grappling with, less than the idea of like this open approach, or that a lot of times they are surprised by, regardless of the institution, but a lot of times kind of go with. I sometimes see some variation to where students will take it and the degree to which they'll take it. So when I was teaching at Emerson, I saw a lot more like production of video content as related to assignments than I might have seen at the community college. And some of that is familiarity, some of that is willing to take risks, or having been, you're dealing with a very middle and upper middle class student population at Emerson who have been encouraged to take risks versus students at the community college. Risks for them have meant life or death differences. And so their willingness to kind of, well, I'm going to try a video versus I'm going to try something at least I'm more comfortable with or have had more exposure to.
I've got a question for you, Lance. How have administrators reacted to open pedagogy? Deans, department heads, whatever. First of all, do you tell them in advance of your approach, and have some said, well, not this time, we want this? Just can you talk about how administrators react in general?
Sure. So, I mean, it varies by institutions. The institutions where it's more cookie cutter, and I've taught at places where, you as instructor, you're there as like discussion facilitator and grader, and not really developer of course content. And in those situations, I have much less say over the course content in how I work with it. At most other places, though, when it comes up, there's usually interest. I think, so it helps a lot that I'm an instructional designer by day, in that it's not just that I'm an instructional designer, but I have the teaching experience of having taught over 100 courses, only a quarter of which have been online. So those two things coupled together, when I talk to administrators, I probably get a bit more leeway than the faculty members fresh off the street, so to speak, or the person who's teaching a course for the first time. I could see there being some hesitancy, only because there's so many factors into that, into the first few times you're teaching a course, that if you come in and you're like, I'm just going to try all of these things, and if that administrator isn't as familiar, that's going to be a little more anxiety producing than somebody that has the background that I do. But by and large, I've received positive reactions to it. I've had people be curious, have people who want to borrow or at least hear more about it than I have. I can't think of any incidents where somebody's been like, oh, that won't go here, that won't fit here.
And I assume your student evaluations reflect how much they enjoy the approach?
I have definitely, so the pop culture course, I'll say, is a little harder to get full evaluations on, because the institute that I'm at still mails out evaluations to online students, because it's 2018, 19. So those have never been, like, those are literally, you only get back from the student that is unhappy, and that has been the case. Like, I've gotten one or two evaluations back, and it's usually been somebody who has an axe to grind. And a lot of times that axe is around, it was a pop culture course that was challenging. Outside of that, when I've taught literature courses, where it wasn't or it was hybrid or face-to-face, I did get really interesting student evaluations. I also had 2 instances In that course, I had created it as a hybrid flexible course. So students, talking about choice, students could take the course entirely online, entirely face-to-face, or move back and forth as their life needed. And I had a situation where 3 weeks in, a student who was dedicated to coming face-to-face every class and had been there got a full-time job. In a traditional sense, that student would have had to been like, see you later. I've got to abandon this degree this semester, throw that money out. But the student was able to move online, didn't miss a beat, and was able to complete the course. And that was part of the evaluation. He's like, I would have had to drop out. The other student decided to go online, wasn't doing that well. And so there was a stipulation of, if you're not doing well in the online, you need to come back face-to-face. Student came back and redeemed themselves from close to a failing grade to a high B. And that too also came in the evaluation.
Might have time for one more quick question. Anybody has any?
This is just specific. What do you think about using Screencast-O-Matic? I'm just starting to take a look at it. I'm putting together an online course.
Yep.
And just some basic thoughts about it, what to do, not to do, what you like, what you don't like?
I love it. So that's my first reaction. I've done most of my video recording with Screencast-O-Matic. The tips I always give anybody who's going to use it, start with a script. Even if you go off that script, you have something to start with, and that helps to make sure the video becomes accessible so that you can do closed captions and the like. The other piece is really aim for the snippets of 5 to 7 minutes. In the video content that I've created, as soon as I'm done with the doctorate, that's the next thing I'm doing, is going back and recreating those videos to 5 to 7 minutes and chunking them up, only because A, that's what we know in terms of learning and cognitive load is effective. B, for students, if they have to scan through a half-hour video to find that 30-second clip, that's time they think about, that's time they considered on task, right? Time that they're doing homework. So the shorter those videos are and the better clarifying what's in them, the more effective it is for them to go study or go revisit a lecture or things like that. Because if they've got to spend 5 minutes searching for this 30-second clip, that's 5 minutes they've lost to learning. Because they'll consider it, and I think it's fair, that's part of their learning, is finding, like, if the material isn't easy to get to. So I would say those would be the few big tips. And actually, here's one other. When you're narrating, if you can, stand up. And what I found is, particularly if it's content you're familiar with and that you're used to standing up and talking about it, it just comes out differently. I can tell you when I listen to my videos which ones I'm sitting down and which ones I'm standing up, because there's a more natural flow. I have better projection. So it's a small tip, but you'll find, especially if you are a talker and a stander, it produces a difference in the quality of projection.
Well, let's give Lance a big round of applause. I think he's given us lots of food for thought.
One thing at a time, right? Just remember that.